The call came through at 11:47 p.m. on June 3, 1944. Not a whisper, not a rumor passed between frightened men in a basement. A direct, specific, actionable intelligence report delivered through official SS channels to the German High Command in France. The report said the invasion was coming. It named the time frame. It identified the coastal sector. It came from a source embedded inside the Allied deception apparatus, a man who had spent months feeding disinformation back to Berlin, but who, on this particular night, was not feeding disinformation at all. He was telling the truth, and the men who received it went to bed. What happened in the 72 hours that followed would shape the entire outcome of the Normandy campaign. The decisions made and unmade on the German side of the Channel in those 3 days would cost thousands of lives and ultimately determine whether the Western Front would hold or collapse. The Allied landings succeeded not merely because of superior logistics, overwhelming air power, or the genius of deception planning. They succeeded in part because the Germans received accurate intelligence about the invasion and chose, twice, not to act on it. This is the story of that intelligence and the man who delivered it and the system that buried him. To understand how a senior SS officer could know about D-Day 3 days before it happened, you have to understand the world he operated in, a world of mirrors, counter-mirrors, and deliberate fog so thick that even the men constructing the lies sometimes lost track of what was real. His name was Wilhelm Canaris. Actually, no. The man at the center of this particular buried history was not Canaris, though Canaris hovers over the entire story like a ghost. The officer in question was SS Sturmbannführer Hans Daufeld, a counterintelligence analyst attached to Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the SS intelligence service, operating out of Paris in the spring of 1944. Daufeld was not a field agent. He was an analyst, a processor of patterns, a man who read intercepts, cross-referenced agent reports, and built probability matrices from fragments. He was, by the accounts of his own colleagues, extraordinarily good at his job. By May of 1944, Daufeld had become deeply suspicious of the German intelligence picture regarding the Allied invasion buildup. Not because he had a source inside SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, but because of what he wasn't seeing. The volume of agent traffic coming out of Britain was too clean, too consistent, too perfectly aligned with what German High Command wanted to believe, that the main invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy.
In intelligence work, when everything confirms your assumptions, that is not confirmation. That is a red flag.
Daufeld began filing dissenting assessments in April. He noted statistical anomalies in the agent reports being forwarded from Abwehr networks in Britain, networks that, unknown to most of the SD at the time, had been entirely turned by British intelligence and were operating as controlled double agents under the supervision of MRIB-5's Double Cross Committee. Every single German agent in Britain had been captured, turned, or eliminated. The intelligence flowing from them was manufactured in a building in London and designed specifically to reinforce German conviction that Normandy was a feint. Daufeld could not prove any of this with certainty, but he built a case, a documented analytical case filed through proper channels in late April and again in mid-May, arguing that the Pas-de-Calais intelligence picture bore the hallmarks of a systematic deception operation. Both reports were reviewed. Both were dismissed. The dismissal of the first report came from his direct superior, who noted in the margin, and this marginal note survived the war in captured SD files, that Daufeld was allowing analytical pessimism to override operational intelligence. The dismissal of the second report came from a level higher. SS Brigadeführer Walter Schellenberg's department, which oversaw SD foreign intelligence. The reasoning, as communicated back to Daufeld, was that his conclusions contradicted the assessments of multiple established agents, whose track records were considered reliable.
Those agents were double agents. Their track records were fabricated.
Daufeld knew none of this. He only knew that the picture didn't add up. By the 1st of June, 1944, Daufeld had shifted his focus from the strategic question, where will they land, to the tactical question, when. The trigger for this shift was a set of intercepted French resistance communications that, when cross-referenced with patterns in BBC French-language broadcasts, suggested activation signals were being transmitted. The BBC's messages personnels, personal messages, broadcast to the French resistance were known to carry coded alerts. What Daufelt identified, working through June 1st and 2nd with a small team of signals analysts, was a clustering of specific prearranged phrases that matched the activation codes German counterintelligence had previously extracted from captured resistance operatives. On the night of June 1st, the BBC had broadcast the first line of Paul Verlaine's poem Chanson d'automne, Les sanglots longs de violon de l'automne. This was, as German counterintelligence had known since the capture of a resistance courier in 1943, the first alert: invasion within 2 weeks. Standard protocol at that point was heightened readiness. Some German units received that alert. Many did not respond with meaningful urgency. On the night of June 3rd, the BBC broadcast the second line, Blessant mon cœur d'une langueur monotone. This was the action signal. Invasion within 48 hours. Daufelt filed his report at 11:47 p.m. on June 3rd. He stated clearly, the activation sequence was complete. The invasion was imminent. The 48-hour window placed the assault on the night of June 5th to 6th. He noted that weather conditions in the Channel, then deteriorating, might push the timing to the outer edge of that window, but that the signal sequence left no analytical ambiguity. The operation was in motion. His superior, Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Kiefer, received the report within the hour. Kiefer did not forward it up the chain of command that night. According to post-war testimony and captured documents, Kiefer's reasoning was that the weather forecast, which showed severe channel conditions, made an imminent landing logistically impossible. He believed the BBC signals had been analyzed out of context, that their meaning had been inflated by an analyst who had already demonstrated a tendency toward alarmist conclusions. He filed Daufelt's report in a pending tray. It sat there while the paratroopers were already boarding their aircraft. On the morning of June 4th, Daufelt escalated. He bypassed Kiefer and sent a summary of his analysis, a shorter, more urgent version, directly to the SD liaison attached to Army Group B, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's command. This was a procedural violation. It was also an act of professional desperation from a man who had spent 2 months watching accurate analysis disappear into institutional indifference. The liaison received the summary. He noted it. He did not wake Rommel with it. Rommel was not there to be woken, in any case. On the morning of June 4th, Rommel had left his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon and driven back to Germany to visit his wife on her birthday, and then continue to Berchtesgaden to meet with Hitler and request additional panzer reserves. He had left because the weather forecast convinced him, as it convinced nearly every senior German commander in France, that no invasion was possible in the near term. The seas were too rough. No competent commander would attempt a channel crossing under those conditions. This was the meteorological gamble that Eisenhower took and won. The Germans had fewer weather stations in the Atlantic than the Allies. They were working from incomplete data. They saw the storm and concluded pause. The Allied meteorologists, specifically Group Captain James Stagg, identified the narrow window of relative calm on June 5th to 6th and advised Eisenhower to proceed. The Germans were reading the same sky and seeing a reason to stand down. Daufelt's report, which bypassed weather considerations entirely because signals intelligence doesn't care about the weather, went unread at the level that could have acted on it. On June 4th, the German 15th Army, stationed near Pas-de-Calais, had received the BBC Verlaine signal and gone to full alert. The 7th Army, responsible for Normandy, had not been placed on equivalent alert status. This distribution of urgency tells you everything about which direction German High Command expected the blow to fall. On June 4th, Admiral Theodor Kranke, commander of Naval Group West, looked at channel conditions and formally assessed that Allied naval operations in the next several days were unlikely. He recorded this in the war diary. On the evening of June 4th, most senior German commanders in France were either away from their posts at social engagements or asleep at something approaching normal hours. Daufelt spent June 4th waiting. The first reports of paratroopers began arriving at German command posts shortly after midnight on June 6th.
At 1:11 a.m., confused and contradictory accounts of airborne landings near Sainte-Mère-Église and the Orne River estuary began reaching 7th Army headquarters. The duty officer, unsure whether this constituted a major operation or a diversionary raid, waited for additional confirmation before escalating. At 1:30 a.m., General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, was notified. He was cautious. The initial airborne drops could be a deception, a small-scale provocation designed to trigger a German response and reveal defensive positions before the real assault elsewhere. This was not an irrational concern. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of thinking that the Allied deception planners had spent months cultivating. At 2:15 a.m., reports of additional airborne landings, heavier and more widespread, reached higher command. The picture was solidifying. Something large was happening. At 4 a.m., General Hans von Salmuth, commanding the 15th Army near Pas-de-Calais, was still more concerned about his sector than Normandy. The deception had worked at the strategic level. Even as paratroopers were fighting in the dark above Normandy, German command energy was divided and misdirected. The critical armored reserves, specifically the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr, sat immobilized. Rommel was in Germany. The two senior generals who could have ordered the Panzer Reserve into motion, von Rundstedt and Rommel, had conflicting authority over those divisions and had previously failed to resolve that conflict with Hitler. When von Rundstedt, awakened in the early hours of June 6th, attempted to release the reserves on his own authority, he was refused by OKW, Hitler's supreme headquarters. The Führer was asleep. No one would wake him. The reserves required his personal authorization to move. Hitler slept until nearly noon. The panzers did not move until afternoon. By then, the beachhead was established. In the weeks after the invasion, as the Wehrmacht struggled to contain and then failed to contain the Allied breakout from Normandy, the question of how the landings had achieved strategic surprise became a matter of internal German inquiry, not a public one, an internal one, conducted within the SD and the Wehrmacht command structure, aimed at understanding what had failed in the intelligence process. Daufeldt's reports were reviewed in this context. The review found, quietly, that his analysis had been substantively correct. The Verlaine signal interpretation, the anomalies in agent reporting, the dissenting assessments filed in April and May, all of it, in retrospect, constituted an accurate reading of the situation. His report filed at 11:47 p.m. on June 3rd was acknowledged in internal SD correspondence as prescient. That word, prescient, is doing an enormous amount of work in those documents. It transforms accurate intelligence into luck. It reframes a systematic analytical success as an inexplicable personal intuition, the kind of thing you note with mild admiration and then set aside because it doesn't assign blame to anyone specific. Kiefer, who had filed Daufeldt's report in a pending tray, was not disciplined. He remained in his position. The post-war record on Kiefer is sparse, partly because the SD operational records from Paris were partially destroyed in the chaotic withdrawal of German forces from France in August 1944. The SD liaison, who failed to escalate Daufeldt's summary to Army Group B, is identified in only one captured document, a witness statement taken by American intelligence officers in 1945, and is referred to only by rank and function, not by name. Rommel, who had left his post for Germany on June 4th and was therefore absent from command at the most critical moment in the history of the Atlantic Wall, subsequently constructed a narrative in which the German failure at Normandy was primarily a function of Hitler's Panzer Reserve decision and the Luftwaffe's inability to contest Allied air superiority. Both of these factors were real. Neither of them is the complete story. The complete story includes a man in Paris who wrote the truth down and handed it to the system, twice, and watched the system put it away. There is a particular kind of institutional failure that does not look like failure in the moment. It looks like prudence. It looks like experienced judgment overriding the anxiety of a junior analyst who has been previously characterized as prone to pessimism. It looks like the responsible application of existing frameworks to new information. It looks, in short, like competence. The German intelligence failure before D-Day was not primarily a failure of information gathering. It was a failure of information processing. and specifically, a failure at the point where accurate analysis met institutional assumption. The assumption, Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy, storm makes invasion impossible, multiple confirmed agents support the existing assessment, was so deeply embedded in the German command architecture that contradictory evidence was not evaluated on its merits. It was evaluated against the assumption and found wanting. Daufelt's mistake, if you can call it that, was that he was right. Being right inside a system that has committed itself to a wrong assumption is a form of institutional insubordination, regardless of rank or documentation. His April report was dismissed. His May report was dismissed. His June 3rd report was filed away. His June 4th escalation, the one that bypassed his superior and went directly to Army Group B, was the act of a man who understood that the clock had run out on proper procedure. It arrived too late by hours, or was ignored too thoroughly to matter. The historical record does not allow complete certainty about which. What the historical record does allow is this. At 11:47 p.m. on June 3, 1944, a German SS officer wrote down that the invasion of Normandy was coming within 48 hours. He was correct. His report was read by a superior who decided the weather made it impossible. The weather was not consulted about this decision. 156,000 Allied troops crossed the Channel 2 days later. The German command, when questioned afterward, did not say they were deceived. They said they had weighed the evidence and made a reasonable judgment. That is the most accurate and the most damning thing they could have said. When the system finally looked back at Daufelt's work, when the internal review used the word prescient, it was completing the burial it had started in April. Prescience is personal. It cannot be reported up a chain of command. It cannot be held responsible for its own dismissal. It belongs to the individual and dissolves accountability in the institution. His reports didn't fail because they were wrong. They failed because the institution was not built to receive a truth that contradicted what it had already decided to believe. And that is not a problem unique to the German High Command in the spring of 1944. That is the architecture of every institutional catastrophe that has ever been investigated, documented, and then quietly forgotten before the next one. The paratroopers were already in the air before anyone thought to check the pending tray.